For years, we were told it was just a tragedy, but the MCCANN family never spoke about this detail. And when you discover what they hid, you'll understand why the world never knew the full truth. Imagine a golden frame hanging on the wall of an empty room. Inside it, the portrait of a blonde girl with big eyes, as if she were always looking back at whoever sees her. A symbol of hope, a reminder of something that had yet to end. Now imagine that behind this frame, there is a crack in the plaster, almost imperceptible, but it's there, growing. And the more you look at the portrait, the less you notice the wall that is crumbling. That is how the Madeleine McCann case was treated for years, like a polished, untouchable image, with a frame of compassion built by the press, by politics, and by public opinion. Except that this frame hides cracks that no one wanted to see. All this time, the story you know was told in only one way, that of a couple devastated by a tragedy. And yes, that pain is real. But what if I told you that behind this mourning, there are choices, silences, and omissions that were never explained? There are records, there are contradictions, there are documents that never appeared, and there is a pattern that repeats every time something uncomfortable arises. It is ignored, silenced, or treated as speculation. But why? Why did certain details never come to light? And furthermore, why did the family themselves seem intent on not talking about them? What shocks most about this story isn't the disappearance. It's what happened afterward. While the world was searching for answers, versions were being exchanged, clues were lost, and above all, some questions, the most obvious ones, were never asked. Why did the rental car days after the disappearance show traces of human blood? Why did the dogs indicate the smell of death in the apartment? Why did Kate's diary, with intimate entries, vanish from the media's radar? These questions carry an unsettling weight, a discomfort that few are willing to face. Because when the pain comes from someone with status, with prestige, with the perfect image, the world hesitates to doubt. And that is where the problem lies, in the pain that becomes a shield, in the suffering that prevents the full truth from being seen. What comes next is not easy to hear, but maybe after this, you will never see this case the same way again. Because what the McCann family never wanted the world to discover is about to be revealed. If you feel that something has always been out of place, follow me. This is going to make sense. Everything seemed aligned with the perfect tragedy. A British couple, both doctors, traveling with their small children to a resort in Portugal. Spring sunshine, friends gathered, wine on the table, a peaceful holiday routine like so many others. And then, chaos. Madeleine McCann, 3 years old, disappears from her room while her parents dined at the hotel restaurant. The news spreads in a matter of hours. The British press enters the scene, photos of the girl everywhere, interviews with family and friends. In a few days, the McCann couple was seen not only as victims, but as symbols of suffering. The story the world heard was told from the beginning. They were good parents, decent people, wronged by a cruel fate. But that is where the problem begins. Because while the public narrative was being molded around Kate and Jerry McCann as the perfect parents, something very different was beginning to take shape within the police investigation. The first major fissure appeared on the very night of the disappearance. The times reported by the parents and by the friends who dined together at the tapas bar did not match. The versions varied, and they were not small variations. They were fundamental details. Who saw Madeleine for the last time? When exactly was she checked on? Was the door locked or unlocked? These questions, which should have been simple, began to get lost in a sea of exchanged versions. And the most intriguing part, instead of pressing for clearer answers, the media coverage softened the facts. It was as if the public image of the McCanns was more important than the contradictions on paper. While the Portuguese police tried to understand what had really happened that night, in the United Kingdom, the narrative was already decided. The couple was innocent, and anything suggesting otherwise sounded offensive. In practice, this emotional judgment had a name: the halo effect. The theory is simple. When someone has a strong enough positive image, that impression taints all other aspects of perception. If they are doctors, British, attentive parents loved by the media, then they can only be victims. That is what happens when charisma overshadows the facts. The very public gaze that should have questioned ended up protecting. And the Portuguese police, who were trying to investigate cautiously, began to be portrayed as incompetent and even prejudiced. The British press itself, in an aggressive manner, started a campaign discrediting the investigators. One of the headlines read, "Portuguese police chase innocent parents while kidnapper escapes." But there was one detail that no one could ignore: The McCann's response time after noticing the disappearance was strange, and the emotional coldness in the first hours also drew attention. The way Kate described her daughter's absence, "They've taken her," sounded more like a scripted line than a spontaneous reaction. This phrase would become symbolic. It was also around this time that Tony Blair's name discreetly appeared in the background. The then Prime Minister is said to have applied diplomatic pressure so that the case was treated with delicacy. There is no direct evidence of interference, but the British ambassadors in Portugal, days after the disappearance, were already working closely with the McCanns and their lawyers. At that point, the doubt was no longer just about what had happened to Madeleine. It was about how far certain questions could go, and who was authorizing that they stop halfway. The result? A carefully protected narrative, a truth that was shaped according to what could or could not as be accepted publicly, and a silence that, more than being uncomfortable, became a shield. Not always is what seems untouchable because it is innocent. Sometimes it's because no one had the courage to dig deeper. And now that this veil has begun to move, what comes next reveals not only flaws, but decisions. Some made hastily, others with calculation, and all of them left marks, clearly visible to those who decide to look without filters. The scene the world saw was heart-wrenching. Shaken parents, swollen eyes, the press massed around the hotel. But while the cameras recorded that moment of pain, behind the scenes, a very different game was already being set up. Hardly anyone knows that, a few hours after Madeleine's disappearance, a press consultancy team was activated directly from the United Kingdom. And it wasn't just any team, it was one of the most expensive of the time, specialized in public crises. It was this group that went on to manage all of the McCann's communications with the world. The question is, why does someone who just lost their daughter need to control the narrative so much? Let's only release the essentials, okay? One of the consultants is said to have told witnesses close by. The focus needs to be emotional. Show the love, not the doubts. Meanwhile, across the ocean, British newspapers mobilized to shield the couple's image. Headlines with words like tragic, devastating, and unfair dominated the covers. Not a single line about the initial contradictions, no mention of the exchanged accounts among the family's own friends. And when the Portuguese police tried to make the parents formal suspects, the reaction was to discredit the investigators, calling them incompetent, amateurs, and even vengeful. It seemed that suddenly the focus was no longer on finding Madeleine. It was on protecting her parents. The pressure wasn't limited to headlines. Influential political figures stepped in. The British ambassador visited the McCanns personally in the first days, and according to official documents, there was constant communication between the United Kingdom government and the Portuguese police, something unusual for an isolated criminal case. All this led to serious investigations being stifled. A detailed police report pointed out contradictions in the children's checkup times, signs that the timeline did not add up. But this document was never released by the British press. The stage was set, and while everyone was watching the spectacle of commotion, no one noticed what was happening behind the scenes. And that is exactly where the secret hides. The most frightening thing about this case isn't what was said, it's what was silenced. After the parents were officially removed from the status of suspects, the media coverage changed completely in tone. They were not only exonerated, but began to be treated almost like heroes. Documentaries, interviews, invitations to international events, all carefully managed by the same public relations team. Meanwhile, part of the money raised in the Find Madeleine Fund was redirected, but not to field searches. A good part was used to pay lawyers who sued media outlets or investigators who raised suspicions about the couple. Even ex-police officer Gonçalo Amaral, who led the initial investigation, was prosecuted after publishing a book detailing everything he saw, including details that never appeared in British headlines. He lost his job, his reputation, and nearly his freedom. They didn't want justice, they wanted control. This phrase is attributed to one of the Portuguese investigators, years after the case was closed, and when one of the sniffer dogs indicated the smell of blood and traces of a corpse in the apartment and in the rental car used by the McCanns, the report was minimized. They claimed the dog could have been mistaken, and the story died there. Now think with me, how many times have you seen a father or mother be spared from investigation just because they appeared emotionally shaken? How many times has the public image been used as a shield against the truth? This case turned into a lit stage, but while the audience applauded, the real play was taking place behind the curtains. And what the MCCANN family never wanted the world to discover might just be exactly what was not said, that the official version of events, the one everyone knows, was carefully constructed, and that every strange piece that didn't fit was simply thrown away before anyone noticed. And when the curtain finally began to tremble, it wasn't because of new evidence. It was because some questions insisted on standing up, even when everyone wanted them to fall into oblivion. But the problem with questions is that eventually someone decides to answer them. And it is at that moment, when everything seems too resolved, too silent, that the most disturbing details finally come to light. Now the question is no longer what happened, but why did they never want us to know? With every fact that was silenced, the family's reactions seemed less emotional and more calculated, as if they had learned to deal with questions without giving answers, as if every silence had been rehearsed. The case of the sedatives, for example. During the investigations, close friends of the couple discreetly raised the possibility that the children had been sedated that night. The explanation? So that they would sleep better. But no tests were done. No line of inquiry pursued that avenue. The silence fell like a curtain, and no one dared to lift it again. Then came the sniffer dogs, animals trained to detect the scent of a corpse. One of them stopped in front of the bedroom closet. Another barked next to the trunk of the rental car used by the parents weeks after the disappearance. The reaction? It must have been a mistake. But have you ever seen a sniffer dog err by chance twice? And what about the door? First it was locked, then unlocked. The details seem small until you realize that it is precisely the change in the narrative that determines whether someone entered or left with the girl, a change that cannot be explained merely by faulty memory. When intimate pages from Kate's diary surfaced, the shock wasn't just about the content, which showed exhaustion, guilt, emotional outburst. It was about the speed with which the subject vanished. No official statement, no explanation, nothing. And then, even with all of this, the case was closed, and when it was reopened, part of the original investigation documents released. If you put these pieces together like a puzzle, you realize that the final image does not just show a missing child. It shows an effort, silent, well-orchestrated, to keep certain parts of the story out of the public's reach. Now think with me. What if the biggest secret of this family isn't about what happened, but about everything they made sure to leave out? What does that reveal about what really happened that night? That is when the climax turns into something else. It stops being about Madeleine's disappearance and becomes about the disappearance of the truth. A truth that bleeds behind the scenes, but never drips onto the main stage. The public image of pain and despair was preserved so carefully that any detail outside the script seemed like a direct threat, and everything that threatened was silenced. The sound of the dogs, the contradiction about the door, the torn pages of the diary, the documents forgotten in diplomatic drawers. None of that disappeared. It was left behind. And the question remains, why? Perhaps because the real truth is more disturbing than the comforting version. Perhaps because admitting certain mistakes would tear down the whole structure built around the case. Or maybe because someone knew that if the truth came out, there would be no way to erase the damage. Either way, now that you know these pieces that almost no one dares to touch, the question changes again. It is no longer, why did they hide this? It is, what else is missing? And when you think that everything has already been said, comes the final detail, the one that is still kept hidden. And that is when the next part begins, when you realize that what has already been revealed may be just the beginning. You know what scares me the most about this case? It isn't the disappearance itself, no matter how absurd and tragic it is. Not even the fact that the investigation failed on so many levels. What keeps me awake is the silence. The way that, in the face of so many legitimate questions, the world simply looked away. Because there was a moment that few remember when things could have taken a different turn. When certain clues could have been followed with more courage. When certain documents could have been taken seriously. But at that decisive moment, someone decided that it was more convenient to protect the image than to seek the truth. And that is when this story stops being about the MCCANN family and becomes about all of us. Because if this silence was possible in a case with so much visibility, with so much commotion, with so many people paying attention, what do you think happens when no one is watching? Madeleine's face became a symbol of empathy around the world. But behind the smiling photo, there were exchanged versions, ignored hints, accounts that changed. And even so, hardly anyone stopped to ask, why? Maybe because the truth, up close, wasn't so clean. Maybe because it was easier to blame an invisible kidnapping than to face the mistakes that were right in front of us. But now that you've seen what was erased from the headlines, you can no longer pretend that none of this matters. You can't pretend that the dog that detected the smell of death was just playing. You can't pretend that the mother's diary was just an outpouring without weight. You can't pretend that the change in the story about the door was a simple lapse. And much less can you pretend that all this was investigated with the same vigor one would expect from an ordinary case. Because it wasn't. This case showed that when there is status, money, influence, even the way justice views a story changes. The image becomes a shield, the commotion becomes a distraction, and the pain becomes a script. It's as if the world had chosen what it wanted to believe. And from then on, any truth that threatened that choice was treated as inconvenient. And what hurts the most about all this is imagining that, if it were a poor family, without access to famous lawyers, without powerful friends, without a press willing to protect them, maybe today we'd be talking about something else. Maybe the story would have taken a very different turn. This is the part that no one likes to hear, but it is the one that needs to be said the most. Because it is not enough to feel pity, it is not enough to share a photo. We need to learn to look at things with a little more discomfort and with much more courage. And if there is one thing I learned making this video, it is that the truth may hide, but it leaves traces. Sometimes in disconnected testimonies, sometimes in smells that the eyes cannot see, sometimes in the haste with which they try to change the subject. The truth doesn't disappear, it is pushed into the corners. But as soon as someone turns on a flashlight, it comes back. And that is why this channel exists. It is not to make spectacle. It is to shed light on what was erased. It is to ask the questions that no one else asks. And if you've come this far with me, it's because you feel it too. That unease, that lump in your throat that appears when you realize that sometimes the problem isn't just what happened, but what they chose to hide. And if you want to go even deeper into this puzzle, in the first pinned comment, there is something that might help you. It's an important piece, a clue that almost no one noticed. Click there and tell me what you think afterward. Now tell me, what was the detail that left you most disconcerted? Comment down below. And if you felt that this video opened your eyes to something you had never thought about, share it. Because there are people who still think it was just a tragedy. And if you are the type who prefers to face discomfort rather than settle for the prettier version, comment here. I am a truth hunter. That way I'll know you stayed with me until the end. Oh, and if this story made you rethink what justice means, subscribe, because the next video will shake everything you believe about right, wrong, and what lies in between. The truth is uncomfortable, but that is precisely why it matters so much.